welcome to another Nerdy Agent Podcast Business Tip of the Week.
Business tip.
It's the business tip of the week.
Minus AJ.
Was that my best attempt at being AJ?
Yeah, this week, I have been told we sound alike. Weird.
That was the feedback I got the first time I did this podcast. And was like, it's a great podcast, but I can't tell who's talking.
Every time I have somebody that tells me that they listen to our podcast, I tell them to listen and act like I'm these two because we sound alike. So I say I'm Josh or AJ.
Should we start being like referring to every person by name as we talk the whole time?
Business tip of the week this week. We're going to discuss when you're with somebody and they say, how's the market? This is the most standard question I think real estate agents get. And so it's important to go through it. So Josh, how's the real estate market?
It's a good question, Luke. What I would tell other agents is be very thoughtful about who you're talking to when you answer this question, right? Because the market is very different depending upon what your current situation is. Broadly speaking, right now, the market is actually down, right? So we're down about 30% in sales year over year. So there are fewer sales happening and there's less available for people to buy. So we have an inventory shortage in Minnesota and we have fewer transactions happening right now. That said, the chaos that would ensue, whether you're a buyer or seller, whether you're in a lower price point or a higher price point, obviously is very different. So key things to call out, interest rates have risen very drastically. That's impacting how each of those markets is playing out. If you're in a first-time home buyer price point, what I tell people is if you're selling or buying, that market is much more competitive. So it's more seller-friendly on the first-time home buyer price point because the people that are competing in that market are going to be people that are debating renting versus buying. So buying a house, even at rates of 6.75 to 7, still looks competitive based off of the alternative, which is renting, right? You still look at that math and you go, it still kind of makes sense for me to pursue this. So we've still seen a lot of scenarios in which there's competition within that marketplace. The other point I make to buyers and sellers on that level is that because of the interest rate rise, a lot of people that are looking to move up from that market and sell their houses are comparing the option of renting their current place with the option of selling it.
Renting it out to a tenant.
Mm-hmm. So they're saying, I have an interest rate of 3 to 4%, so therefore I actually should just hold this house and rent it because the market's still going up because there's a lot of demand on the buy side and there's nothing for them to buy. So that's continued to create a bigger supply shortage in the lower price brackets, which has created more competition because there's already more buyers in those price brackets. And so if you are someone looking to be a first-time home buyer right now, what I would say is the market will be very competitive and we'll have to talk about some other things, the contingencies and how we evaluate each of those, escalation clauses, some of the other stuff we've talked about on this podcast before. They're going to need to come into play because there's just not enough inventory from a supply and demand standpoint to keep the buyers at bay at this point in time. The other point I make to a lot of those guys is, like I have a seller who wants to list right now in that price point. You want to list sooner rather than later because lease timeframes become very important because your buyer pool is made up of primarily renters. So a lot of the people that would be evaluating your home may be choosing to get out of the market and go rent for another year because they've been losing for 2 months and their lease is up in July and maybe they have to make a decision if they want to keep doing this or not. So Minnesota, at least, a lot of summer leases, but most of the time across the country, summer leases tend to be the most common because that's when, if you're a younger person, your first rental was probably in the summer because you graduated from college and then you stay on that lease cycle. So timing is also hugely important in that stuff. If you're a move-up buyer or a higher price point buyer, so if I'm talking, where that range is in Minnesota, there's like a $5 to, I would say, close to $800,000 range or $400,000 to $800,000 range where it's like you're kind of out of first-time buyer territory. And then there's like an 800,000 plus range where you're out of, I think the higher
like luxury almost you would call it possibly.
Yeah, I just think there's always a ceiling point where it's like, I think up to about 800 Minnesota right now. It's still quite competitive because there's move up buyers that are looking for those places and there's not a lot of available inventory. That tends to be made up of people that are having their first or second kid and need a little more space and need to move up, but have a ceiling on what they can afford. And so there's just limited inventory. There's new construction's a good option for them if they're looking for something different. But in general, that market is more in like the medium competitiveness right now locally.
I think the most important thing there too, not necessarily the most important, but the different responses for the different type of person, right? Because the first thing I typically say is, well, it really depends. Like, do you want to know if you're for buyers or for sellers? Like, who do you want to know it for? Because the first thing that agents always go to is just a generalized version of the market and not a super specific. And so if someone asks that question, your first response is a question.
Yep.
You're showing that you're really thinking about it. Like you're trying to tailor the answer to what they're trying to learn, right?
Yep.
Well, it depends. Like, do you want to know if it's move up buyers? Are you buying your first house? Are you selling a house and buying a house? Are you renting your current house and buying a house?
Yep.
And then you can tailor that response to really, again, like I always say, be the expert in the room.
Yeah. Think macro about it, right? So like, who are you talking to? But also like, your situations that you deal with on an ongoing basis will impact how you think about the actual reality of the market. But the reality of the market is going to be very much more on a micro basis. So if you're looking at your situations and you're like, well, every offer this weekend I put in, I had 4 other offers against me. But every house you're looking at was $300,000 in a popular first-time home buyer neighborhood.
You're talking to someone who owns their house.
Yeah, and they're looking to buy a $900,000 house. You say like, well, last weekend I put 4 offers in, all went into multiples. They're very competitive. You own a house at $350,000. So right now, this marketplace is more competitive. So you'd probably do pretty well on your sell side. Now, the reality is you're going to be moving from a lower interest rate, most likely into a higher interest rate. And so on the buy side, you're in a different bracket of how you're competing. And that kind of goes back to the points I made a little bit ago about what that market looks like. So tailor your message is the one key thing I'd leave you with, but also understand that the market is not one thing. So when someone says, how's the market? You need to be thoughtful enough about the different brackets and where they line up within your local market and how the competitiveness is on each of those for buyers and for sellers.
That's great. And that's this week's Nerdy Agent Podcast Business Tip of the Week.
Business tip.
Goodbye.